History tells us the Merovingians ruled early France and then vanished. But what if they didn't disappear, only changed direction? Medieval chronicles whisper of kings with sacred blood, long hair, and origins that were not entirely human. At the same time, far to the north, Scandinavian legends spoke of a chosen bloodline destined to rule the southern lands. Two traditions, one prophecy, one silence. Was this coincidence or a forgotten connection buried beneath Christian history? Tonight, we follow the trail northward, past monasteries, myths, and erased names, to ask a dangerous question. What if the Merovingian bloodline was never meant to stay in France at all? Chapter 1. The Sacred Blood. In the early centuries after Rome's collapse, power in Western Europe did not belong to institutions. It belonged to blood. The rulers we now call the Merovingian dynasty did not claim authority through law or election. They ruled because they believed and convinced others that their blood was different, sacred, chosen, untouchable. Unlike later Christian kings, Merovingian rulers were not crowned by the church. Their legitimacy came from something older. Their long, uncut hair was not fashion, it was theology. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to destroy his right to rule. Chroniclers described these kings as reges criniti, the long-haired kings, men whose power resided physically within their bodies. This idea was not metaphorical. In the early medieval mind, blood carried memory, destiny, and divine favor. The Merovingians did not merely inherit land, they inherited a condition. At the center of this belief stands the dynasty's shadowy founder, Merovech. Even medieval writers seemed unsure how to describe his origins. One account claims his mother was impregnated not by a man, but by a mysterious sea creature while bathing. Another avoids details altogether, an omission that often speaks louder than myth. These stories were not meant to be taken literally in the modern sense. They served a function, to place Merovingian blood outside ordinary humanity. Not gods, but not fully men either. The church tolerated this mythology at first because it had to. Christianity was still fragile in Frankish lands, and the Merovingians ruled warriors who respected ancestral magic more than Roman theology. So priests adapted. They baptized the kings, but they did not challenge the blood narrative. Yet unease remained. One of the few sources we have, the writings of Gregory of Tours, describe Merovingian rulers with a strange mix of reverence and discomfort. Gregory recorded miracles, omens, and blood feuds in the same tone, never fully endorsing the sacred blood idea, but never denying it either. Silence, again, becomes policy. What matters is not whether the Merovingians truly believed they were semi-divine, but that others believed it for them. Warriors followed them into battle. Nobles married into their line. Rivals hesitated to strike them down. Blood created hesitation. Hesitation creates power. But sacred blood has a weakness. It cannot be explained, only inherited. And once questioned, it collapses. By the 7th century, Merovingian kings were increasingly sidelined, still sacred, still untouchable, but no longer ruling. Real power shifted to mayors of the palace, administrators who governed in the king's name, while carefully preserving the illusion of holy blood. This tension between symbolic blood and practical control marks the beginning of the end. Yet here lies the first unanswered question of this story. If Merovingian blood was truly sacred, why was it never extinguished publicly? Why was it quietly removed from power, yet carefully preserved. Because bloodlines that are merely political are executed, bloodlines believed to be something else are hidden, and hidden blood does not disappear. Chapter 2: The Northern Pull. While the Merovingians ruled Gaul, a different world thrived far to the north. Scandinavia, a land of fjords, forests, and harsh winters, nurtured its own myths of sacred kings and divine bloodlines. In sagas and oral tradition, rulers were described not by armies or law, but by lineage, destiny, and the favor of unseen forces. These northern tales spoke of kings who would cross seas and conquer distant lands, not through conquest alone, but because their blood carried authority beyond mortal reckoning. Merovingian chronicles hint at a strange awareness of this northern world. Some kings, especially in the 5th and 6th centuries, were said to have traveled along the coasts of the North Sea, sending envoys and forming alliances with distant chieftains. Archaeological evidence shows trade routes linking the Frankish heartlands to Danish and Swedish settlements, carrying not just goods but ideas, myths, and symbols. Amber, furs, and iron flowed southward, while northern sagas carried hints of a prophetic bloodline destined to extend beyond the confines of Gaul. This is where the story of the Northern Pull begins. The Merovingians' sacred blood was not merely a local claim, it resonated across the waters, reaching the fjords and forests of Scandinavia. Northern traditions described a long-haired king of distant lands whose coming would be signaled by omens and miracles. The descriptions, remarkably similar to Frankish chronicles, suggest either coincidence or an unseen network of myth and influence spanning hundreds of miles. Yet this connection remained largely invisible. Northern chieftains spoke cautiously of southern kings in hushed tones. Frankish scribes recorded northern tales sparingly, almost dismissively. The reason for this caution was simple. Bloodline, prophecy, and legitimacy were fragile. To misstate a king's origin, or worse, to claim his destiny, could invite deadly consequences. Stories were layered, symbolic, and often encoded in ritual and symbol rather than written plainly. Some scholars argue that Scandinavian sagas may have deliberately preserved Merovingian lore under the guise of local myth. The sea-born king motif, repeated in both northern and southern sources, suggests a narrative strategy, sacred bloodline, connected across geography, preserved through myth and memory, rather than political institutions. If true, this represents one of the earliest examples of a pan-European myth network, a hidden empire of ideas rather than armies. The Northern Pull also explains certain Merovingian strategies. Marriages into northern families, alliances with coastal rulers, and even exploratory missions along the Baltic may have been less about trade or conquest and more about reinforcing sacred legitimacy. Bloodlines intersected, not by chance, but by design. Each union a subtle reinforcement of prophecy and influence. By the late 6th century, the northern connection had become more symbolic than practical. Frankish kings relied less on direct alliances and more on mythic authority. Yet even as the northern threads faded from political relevance, they persisted in stories, omens, and ritual. Hidden observers, monks, scribes, and chieftains kept the memory alive. The Merovingian bloodline had begun to drift northward, not physically, but ideologically, through the invisible currents of belief and expectation. Thus, the Northern Pull was never simply a matter of geography. It was a gravitational force of myth and destiny, drawing the Merovingians' sacred blood toward lands that would preserve its mystery long after their political power vanished. And it is this invisible thread, stretching from Gaul to the fjords, that sets the stage for the next act of our story: the mysterious disappearance of kings and the secrets they carried with them. Chapter 3: Scandinavia Connection. As the Merovingian bloodline reached the end of its political dominance in Gaul, the thread of its influence did not vanish. It stretched northward into the cold fjords, dense forests, and misty shores of Scandinavia. While southern chroniclers grew silent or dismissive, the northern lands preserved a parallel narrative, one in which sacred kings, divine ancestry, and prophecy intertwined in ways that mirrored the Merovingians' own mythology. It is here, in Scandinavia, that the northern echoes of Merovingian power began to take shape. Scandinavian sagas tell of rulers born of mysterious unions, often described as part human, part divine, their fates inscribed in stars, runes, and omens. Some sagas speak of kings whose long hair was sacred, their authority inseparable from their lineage. The parallels to Frankish chronicles are striking. Both the northern and southern kings claimed legitimacy through blood. Both were guided by prophecy, and both carried a symbolic authority that extended beyond their immediate realms. Yet the northern tales carried a harsher, colder tone, one shaped by the unforgiving environment and the constant threat of war, survival, and winter famine. Trade and migration routes between the Frankish heartlands and Scandinavia allowed these myths, symbols, and perhaps even actual individuals to cross the sea. Archaeological finds, Frankish coins in Danish settlements, amber and iron in southern Europe, hint at movement and connection. Some historians suggest that northern rulers may have deliberately aligned themselves with Merovingian ideas, adopting motifs of sacred hair, prophecy, and divine ancestry to consolidate their own authority. These motifs were not superficial. They were deeply woven into ritual, marriage alliances, and royal succession. There are hints, too, in surviving sagas and chronicles of encounters between northern chieftains and southern emissaries. These encounters were rare and often ceremonial, but they carried a weight beyond diplomacy. Gifts, symbols, and messages were exchanged, an unspoken acknowledgement that the sacred bloodline was recognized across borders, oceans, and political boundaries. Some northern families may even have traced their ancestry deliberately back to the Merovingians, claiming divine legitimacy that the Franks themselves no longer wielded. This connection, however, remained largely invisible in southern historical accounts. To the Frankish scribes and chroniclers, the north was distant, mysterious, and largely irrelevant to the political calculations of the Carolingians, who had supplanted Merovingian kings. Yet in Scandinavia, the story persisted, carefully encoded in saga, ritual, and oral tradition. It was preserved in ways that were subtle but potent. A whispered claim here, a ritual there, a line of descent quietly maintained across generations. The Scandinavia connection also illuminates the enduring nature of prophecy. Northern kings were not merely rulers. They were carriers of a narrative, a destiny intertwined with that of the Merovingians. Their legitimacy was validated not by armies or borders, but by recognition of a sacred lineage that spanned the continent. The northern lands became custodians of a story too fragile for political history, yet too powerful to vanish. a story of blood, mystery, and destiny that resisted erasure. By the end of this act, it becomes clear that the Merovingian legacy did not truly end with Carolingian domination. It migrated, sometimes physically, often ideologically, to the north, leaving subtle traces in Scandinavian lore, noble bloodlines, and sacred traditions. The Merovingians may have disappeared from the public eye, but through Scandinavia, their prophecy endured, a hidden network of lineage and influence stretching quietly beneath the surface of medieval Europe, waiting for those who might uncover its secrets. Chapter 4. The Disappearance. By the late 7th century, the Merovingian kings, once sacred rulers of Gaul, had been reduced to shadows. Their political authority had been eroded by the rise of the mayors of the palace, administrators who exercised real power while keeping the figureheads in ceremonial roles. Yet, the disappearance of the Merovingians was more than a mere political shift. It was a carefully orchestrated vanishing act, one that concealed the bloodline rather than erasing it entirely. The sacred hair remained untouchable, the myths survived, and the line itself, whether through secrecy, exile, or migration, continued quietly beyond the reach of official history. Medieval sources offer hints, but they are fragmented and often contradictory. Some chronicles suggest that Merovingian princes were confined to monasteries, their political relevance stripped, but their lives preserved. Others imply that certain members of the dynasty fled northward, crossing the Rhine and integrating with noble families along the coasts of the North Sea. Scandinavian sagas, though cryptic, echo these movements. They describe foreign princes with unusual hair, divine bearing, or prophetic destinies, figures who appear suddenly, linked to events far from Frankish lands. Could these be Merovingians in exile, their legacy quietly absorbed into northern nobility? The disappearance was strategic. The Carolingians, aware of the Merovingians' symbolic power, did not execute them outright. Doing so would have risked inflaming resistance or invoking superstition among the populace. Instead, they relegated the sacred line to obscurity. Kings became ceremonial figures, overseen by palace officials. The true rulers pulled the strings from behind the curtain. The act of erasure was psychological as much as political, a lesson that divine blood could not oppose administrative power indefinitely. Yet this disappearance was not total. Monastic records, cryptic letters, and secret genealogies suggest that certain Merovingian descendants were hidden, preserved, and protected. Some were married into minor noble houses, others concealed under the guise of religious devotion, and a few may have even ventured north to Scandinavia, ensuring that the sacred bloodline survived beyond the reach of public scrutiny. These movements were silent, deliberate, and carefully recorded only in fragments, leaving a trail visible only to those trained to read between lines. The Merovingians' disappearance highlights a fundamental paradox. The line could not rule openly without authority, yet it could not vanish entirely because the myth of sacred blood remained too potent to erase. It became an invisible empire of influence, a legacy that outlasted crowns and armies. Those who held the blood retained symbolic power, even in hiding, shaping dynastic alliances, influencing claims, and maintaining a quiet presence across Europe. By the end of this act, it is clear that the disappearance was not an ending, but a transformation. Political dominance was lost, but myth, prophecy, and bloodline persisted. The Merovingians had withdrawn from the stage, But they had not disappeared from history. They had moved into the shadows, leaving clues, whispers, and subtle legacies that would ripple across generations. The sacred bloodline endured, waiting for those who might recognize its signs and follow its trail northward, into the lands of fjords and forests, where prophecy and lineage would continue to intertwine. Chapter 5. The Midnight Question. The story of the Merovingians, of sacred blood, long hair, and northern connections, reaches a crossroads in the shadows of history. By the end of the 7th century, the political stage had shifted entirely. Carolingian kings held power. The Merovingians existed as ceremonial figures, relics of a line that had once ruled with the weight of divine legitimacy. Yet the disappearance of political authority did not equate to the disappearance of influence. Something remained, something invisible, intangible, and dangerous to ignore: the power of the bloodline itself. This is the midnight question. If the Merovingians no longer held thrones, why did history preserve them at all? Why did scribes, monks, and northern sagas continue to encode their existence long after their supposed end? History, as we read it, is selective. It erases failures, obscures uncomfortable truths, and celebrates victors. Yet the Merovingians, despite their fall, persisted in whispers, genealogies, and ritual practices. Their sacred bloodline, even in obscurity, carried symbolic weight, enough to alter allegiances, inspire claims, and shape narratives in ways the Carolingians could not fully suppress. Consider the northern sagas. These are not straightforward records of conquest or administration. They are stories layered in symbolism, myth, and prophecy. And yet within them lie traces of real connections, alliances, and lineage, echoes of Merovingian blood flowing into Scandinavian dynasties. The suggestion is unsettling. The political disappearance of the dynasty may have been intentional, but the sacred blood itself could not be extinguished. Influence had shifted from the visible to the invisible, from power wielded openly to power embedded in belief, ritual, and secrecy. The broader implication is profound. Throughout history, power rarely disappears entirely. It transforms. The Merovingians teach us that authority is not only a matter of crowns or armies, it is also a function of perception, of belief, and of the stories we are willing to pass along. Sacred blood is a metaphor, yes, but a potent one. It demonstrates how ideas, myths, and lineage can outlive empires and shape human behavior in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Herein lies the true question of Midnight Empire. What if the lines we see in history, the political boundaries, the kings and queens, the battles and treaties, are not the full story? What if invisible forces, hidden networks of bloodlines, and unrecorded alliances quietly shaped the course of nations? The Merovingians, in their northern exile, their quiet monasteries, and their whispered Scandinavian connections, offer us a glimpse of such hidden mechanisms. And so, the question lingers as the night deepens. Did the Merovingians truly vanish, or were they merely shifted to the shadows, leaving traces that only the careful observer can detect? Does the sacred blood survive purely as myth, or does it flow through living descendants, subtly influencing dynasties, politics, and belief long after history claimed the throne? This is the midnight question. Not a riddle with a simple answer, but a doorway. A doorway into hidden histories, invisible empires, and the mysterious networks that connect myth, prophecy, and blood across centuries. For those willing to follow the trail, the journey begins where the light fades, in the shadows of the past, where the Merovingian prophecy continues to whisper. The power of sacred blood may no longer rule openly, but it has never stopped shaping the world, and perhaps it never will. Unlock the secrets of history, subscribe to Midnight Empire, and step into the shadows of the past.